I'm now on the MTK hotline, and I'd like to welcome back my special guest, Derek Shelmerdine, who was on last week talking about Brian Epstein. Derek, welcome back to the Mop Tops The King.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be back.
Is it fair to say the Beatles loved Brian? I mean, they had a close relationship with him, and they were obviously devastated when he died.
Oh, I think so. I think they had a great relationship with him. I mean, it was very different to Elvis's relationship with the Colonel. It wasn't anything like as driven in the sense of the manager being very much in the driving seat. I think there was a much more mutual appreciation of each other with the Beatles. But certainly there are two very distinctive times for the Beatles. There was up to the time that Brian died and afterwards, and they were two very different groups musically and personally, as it were.
I've heard that many people believe that when Brian passed away, that was really the beginning of the end for the Beatles. That was a major influence of them breaking up without Brian at the helm.
I think certainly that it had an impact. I don't think personally the Beatles were ever destined to stay together like, say, the Stones or the Who. But I think the really big differences came, well, they'd never have met Alan Klein. And I think one of the real big differences, they would have stayed together maybe a little bit longer, but I don't think much longer without Brian. But the split itself would have been really quite amicable. So the relationships would have been very different in that second half, if you like, the late 60s. So the songwriting would have been very different as well. And maybe Yoko's influence mightn't have been quite so great. But I think what's interesting is that because of the way they split up after Brian and the whole Alan Klein thing, which wouldn't have happened without Brian's death, I think it affected the solo careers possibly more than it affected the early solo careers, possibly more than it affected the Beatles as such.
Interesting. So, Derek, in August of 1966, the Beatles decided to stop touring. What kind of an impact did this decision have on Brian?
Oh, I think it had a profound impact. As you say, their last gig, Candlestick Park, was the 29th of August, 66. A month later, on the 26th of September, Brian was hospitalized in London with an accidental overdose. He was suffering from depression and anxiety, and the Beatles' decision to stop touring made him more anxious because it left him with an awful lot less involvement in the Beatles' career. And it's more complicated than that because it was actually the end of the Beat era, so all of his other bands were very much on the wane as the new rock music was taking over. And then, of course, just a year later, 27th of August 1967, Brian died from an accidental overdose. The coroner recorded it as accidental death and described it as an incautious overdose.
Yeah.
And the pathologist found traces of antidepressant. So I think it had a major effect on Brian, to be honest.
Yeah, it's sad. And the Beatles were, of course, they were devastated by the news.
Oh, absolutely. They came rushing back from Bangor in North Wales, where they were with the Maharishi. Derek,
there is another subject that I'd like to touch on briefly before you go. Some might consider it the third rail of the Brian Epstein relationship with the Beatles, and that is Brian's relationship with John. I don't want to go into any graphic detail, but I've seen interviews with Paul McCartney and other people. No one really knows if there was an intimate relationship between John and Brian. What are your thoughts on this very touchy and controversial subject?
Well, it's interesting. If you go back to 1963, at Paul's 21st birthday party, John had a fight with a guy called Bob Wooler, who was the cabin DJ and compere. And what had happened, John had been on holiday with Brian to Barcelona, and Bob had been ribbing John about it, and he referred to it as, how was your honeymoon? And John took extreme exception to this and actually beat Bob Wooler up. And what had happened, on the 28th of April, 63, Brian and John went to Barcelona on holiday. And at the same time, exactly the same time, the other three, Paul, George and Ringo, they went off on holiday to Tenerife. But John accepted this invitation from Brian to go to Barcelona. And that's what sparked the rumours that John and Brian were having an affair. And I think John sums it up really quite nicely in a quote himself. And the quote is, I was on holiday with Brian Epstein in Spain where the rumours went around that he and I were having a love affair. Well, it was almost a love affair, but not quite. It was never consummated, but it was a pretty intense relationship. Interestingly, Paul's got a slightly different take on that holiday they went on. Paul thinks that John went with Brian so that he could convince Brian that John was the leader of the Beatles.
Derek, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Mop Tops and the King. We always enjoy when you come on the show. Before we say goodbye, what are your lasting thoughts of the impact that Brian Epstein had on the Beatles?
I mean, it's one of those things you'll never really know, but I think that he was very much the fifth Beatle as well as George Martin. I think you could really call them the fifth Beatle because in their different ways they both really guided the Beatles to become the absolute legend that they are 50, 60 years on. I think he was a very, very important part of their story.
Derek, thanks again for coming on the Mop Tops and the King, and I look forward to the next time we have you on the show. It's always enlightening, always a pleasure. Where can people learn more about you and to buy your book, Rock'n'Roll Unravelled?
Well, the website's a great place to start, and that's rock'n'rollunravelled.com. You can buy the book directly from the website, or it's available on Amazon.
Great. I wish you the best, Derek. Thank you so much again for coming on the Mop Tops and the King.
Oh, my pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you, Steve. It's been great fun.